and welcome to this special edition of EUCOM Report. Next week, General Bernard Rogers will leave his post at SHAPE headquarters in Belgium, where for the past 8 years he served as both Supreme Allied Commander Europe and as the Commander-in-Chief U.S. European Command. Those two commands, while being interrelated, offer separate and distinct areas of responsibility. As the SACEUR, he's the senior NATO military commander, representing 16 nations, reporting through the military committee to the Secretary General of NATO, Lord Carrington. As the SACEUR, General Rogers is responsible for the 325,000 military members of U.S. EUCOM, answering through the Joint Chiefs of Staff to Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger. Sergeant Charlie Gill had the opportunity recently to talk with General Rogers in a wide-ranging discussion of past history and of current events. For the next half hour, we'll listen in on that conversation. General Rogers began by defining his dual-hatted role, and he spoke of how he supports both NATO and U.S. postures, even when the two positions are not necessarily the same.
There are times when the position that I take as a SACEUR may not be the U.S. position that it's taking within NATO. But as a SACEUR, I must judge what's best for NATO, not what's best for the United States or best for Germany or best for the United Kingdom or any nation or group of nations, what's best for NATO as a whole. And whereas in European Command, then I must make my judgment as to what's best for the United States in whatever policy with which we may be dealing. But I should make it very clear that the mission of European Command is to support NATO. The mission of the CINC-EUR, U.S. CINC-EUR, is to support the SACEUR. So the purpose of, insofar as the European continent itself is concerned, you see, and then we break away when we get into Africa or we get into the Middle East. But the primary mission, you see, my primary mission is as a SACEUR. My secondary mission is a CINC-EUR. And that's why I'm the only CINC that has a 4-star deputy, because he runs the European Command for me on a day-to-day basis. And but that role of CINC-EUR is to be a supportive role of the SACEUR, not the other way around.
And you wear both the hats, so you actually have to support yourself. It seems like it would almost be an internal wrestling match sometimes.
No, no, one can sort that out quite well, in fact, because you have your NATO, your Allied Command Europe problems with which you deal, and then you have your EUCOM U.S. problems with which you deal, and you can sort it out fairly easily, I find. I would just make one point here that I'm very proud of my country in that it has never once, when I have taken a position as a SACEUR, which is different from its position within NATO, never once has my country twisted my arm or tried to get me to change my position to be supportive of them. They have honored the fact that I'm an international officer. I represent 16 nations, and therefore should judge what I do as against the criterion of what's best for NATO. And I'm proud of the way my nation has treated me in that respect for the last 8 years.
Wearing your CINC-EUR hat, what is your evaluation of the overall level of training of the U.S. Forces personnel in the U.S. EUCOM area of operation?
Well, I think our level of training, as reported to me by component commanders, and as I judge from the readiness reports that I get, that the level of training is quite high. I know there's a lot of dedicated, diligent effort that's devoted to ensuring that the training is high, and that we meet the high training standards which we've set for ourselves. And I'm encouraged by the number of simulators that we have and are getting into theater, which make it possible for us to train under conditions where we could not otherwise train by going out and firing live ammunition and so on. And there are a number of those within the theater, not unique to any one service. All 3 services have them, and it's very helpful. So, short answer to your question, the level of training here is quite high, and as high as any nation within Allied Command Europe in my other role.
If you would kind of rate the training combined with readiness, if you would, right now in the European Command.
Well, you're talking about two different things. Readiness can best be described as, is the unit capable of moving out quickly and accomplishing the mission that it's been assigned, and doing so for a fairly long period of time? That's readiness. But readiness is, can it move out? Can it get into position? Can it perform as it's supposed to? A part of that, of course, is the training. If it's going to be ready, it has to be trained. So that's a part of it. So the higher level that you have of your training, the more ready your forces are going to be. The greater sustainability that you have, i.e. the supplies and ammunition to keep on fighting, the better you can extend that readiness, you see, on into the future days that you have to have, in which you have to perform your combat. So if the level of training is high, as it is, then the level of readiness is high, assuming that we have the percentage of manpower fill in the right grades, in the proper force structure as it's been designed, with the proper equipment, you see, with which we're training. But those are other elements of readiness besides just the training.
In turning to other matters, recently there have been an increase in the number of married junior soldiers and service members arriving in Europe. In light of the falling dollar, do you think this has had an adverse effect?
Well, it's no question about it having an effect within the family, as the dollar has lost its currency. But on the other hand, we have always believed, back since the days I was a deputy chief personnel, that it was good to have the families with the soldiers. Why shouldn't they, you see, in peacetime? It's their career. Why shouldn't they have their families with them? And it's a stabilizing influence on soldiers to have their families with them. And so my position has always been that a soldier has the right to be married, and therefore, unless conditions preclude his bringing his family with him, he ought to have his family with him. And then the services, in turn, ought to do as much as they possibly can for their soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines to ensure that the conditions are right, i.e. he has the appropriate housing for his family, they have the appropriate facilities such as commissary, post exchanges, Army Community Service Centers, and those of the other services, morale and recreational facilities, proper schools in properly constructed buildings, you know, the whole series, the whole gamut, which is, some people refer to it as standard of living, quality of life. I refer to it as taking proper care of your troops and their families. And it does cause concern on the part of the individual soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine when he cannot take proper care of his family as a result of his having gotten himself into debt, and then he finds the bottom dropping out of the dollar, and thereby having to pay so much more in marks or whatever it may be in order to pay for the debts that he has accumulated. And sure, that's of concern, but it's not lost on the people throughout the hierarchy, right up to Department of Defense, that we have to continue to do something to the best of our means and resources will permit us. And there we have to depend on the Congress.
Do you think Congress is aware of the economic plight of the service members and their families here overseas?
Well, some congressmen are, and senators, and I know that some of the key ones are, because those of us who have the opportunity to appear before the committees make them aware of what has happened here. And you see, I've gone through the cycle completely. When I first came here as a U.S. CINC Euro, the dollar was very low. As a matter of fact, it was lower than it is now. I'm not sure how it was with marks, but in Belgium it was down to 27 to a dollar when we first got here. And my plea to the Congress at that time was, you know, let's do something about it. Let's keep COLA coming. Let's keep COLA, and the Department of Defense keep COLA coming at the proper time. It always seems that it takes so long to get COLA started, but it doesn't take long for them to drop it, you know. It'll drop it within 24 hours. It may take a week or two to get it started or to get it increased. Then, you know, we went up where the dollar was 70 Belgian francs to the dollar. And I think it was 3.2 marks to a dollar, 3.4.
That's a 3.4,
yeah.
exactly.
And it was at that time when some of our troops committed themselves to purchasing things for which they have to pay on time. And then the next thing you know, you're back down, at least in Belgium where I live, you're back down to 37. You see, not all the way down. So we make Congress aware of this. One of the things that disturbs me is the position that the Congress has been taking with respect to morale and welfare and recreation facilities. At the very time when the dollar is down, keeps our troops and their families from going out on the economy as much as they might like to have or had in the past, had done in the past. And then we find that we have to increase the rates of our MWR facilities, bowling alleys or what have you, in order to put them on a paying basis, a pay-as-you-go basis, and we then have to build new facilities out of the profits of that, you see. I think that's flat wrong. I think that the Congress should continue to appropriate the funds for our morale, welfare, and recreation facilities, and we keep them then at a price that everybody can afford. And so when these occasions occur, when most of our troops feel that they have to stay on the base, on post, they can at least afford to participate in the activities that we have on the base form. So I hit that pretty hard with the Congress each time. Then we've got the problem of construction. I signed off 2 letters last night on the construction for our schools, for the Dodge schools. There have been cuts, and I'm trying to intercede at the appropriate level within the Congress so that they'll restore the funds. There have been cuts in training facilities. I signed off 2 letters last night, the heads of committees, calling their attention to this and trying to get their support when it comes before their committee or in the conference between the two sides of between the two houses, so that they'll be restored, those funds will be restored. So we have ways to make the Congress aware, and we do it not only through our appearing before them to testify, but also by sending letters and notes or telephone calls or sending people over to see them. We do all of those things. And it's not only done from the seat of government, where the services are located. We also do it from over here out in the field, too. And I'm not alone in that. Other sinks do the same thing.
I would ask you, sir, have we seen some significant improvements in morale and welfare activities in the last few years, would you say?
Well, we have not seen the improvements, in my opinion, that I would like to have seen because we have not had the appropriated funds. But we are, commanders are, to the best of their ability, continuing to improve them from the income on the pay-as-you-go system, you see. I just think that when you have to, oftentimes have to employ nationals, host nation nationals, in these kinds of facilities, you have to pay them then in their currency. You see, it causes the salary to be considerably higher, reflecting in dollars, than it would otherwise. So I personally don't think that we could have done better, I believe, if we'd had appropriated funds. But I think with the resources we got available, I think the commanders are doing just about as well as they can. And of course, they've got the morale, welfare, recreation boards and committees that meet and discuss these things with them and give them directions in which to go, looking at it in the eyes of the troops and their families.
I got to tell you, though, sir, they closed my favorite ice cream place down in the wintertime to work on it. Now, they could, I mean, in the summertime, rather. In the summertime. They closed it down to revamp the inside of it in the middle of the summer. And I didn't understand it, and they stayed open all winter.
Doesn't make much sense,
does it? It was an ice cream place.
Doesn't make much sense. No. Nope.
My favorite place to go. Oh.
Well, there must have been a reason for it, but sure as hell it isn't obvious, is it?
They could have put a sign explaining it. Beats me. In turning to other subjects, the airmen, the Marines, the Marines, the soldiers, the sailors, these people, under your command, how would you rate them overall in the European command?
Well, I think we've got the best I've ever seen, and not only does that come from what contact I do have with them, but also from my commanders and from the non-commissioned officers, the old-time non-commissioned officers, who I think would agree with me that these are as fine a troops that this country's ever had. As far as I'm concerned, they're the best that I've ever seen. And I started out in 1943 as a platoon leader, and I worked my way up the hierarchy and in the intervening years, and they're the best I've ever seen. And it's attributable to a number of things, none the least of which is the standards that we set in the services that recruits must meet. And the time may come as the number of eligibles coming through the window that could qualify to join one of the services, as that number reduces. It may well be that there'll be talk about reducing standards, you see. I wouldn't want to do that. I'd rather take shortfall than to reduce the standards in time of peace. And that argument will be, you know, do we keep up the strength and lower our standards when we have this difficulty of the numbers reduced that come through the window, or do we keep the standards high and don't fill all our ranks? I'd rather we have the latter than the former. But so far we don't have to do that.
You said that, I remember your conversation with Gary Baltel last time you talked, and you said that the U.S. public doesn't know enough about the role of the U.S. military here in Europe. Now let's take a service member that goes home for leave, or they're getting out of the Army or the Air Force or the Navy or the Marines, and they go home. And someone says, what are you folks doing over there? How should they respond?
Well, I think it's broader than just the military. I think it includes such things as what about the customs, the values, the principles, the ideals, all of those things that make up the United States. Much of it is based right here in Western Europe, comes from Western Europe, because we've thrown open our ports and taken the immigrants, and as a consequence, we have very close and deep and enduring ties with Western Europe. So, and I'm not even, you know, I haven't even talked about the economy of it and the need to keep the trade flowing across the Atlantic both ways. But what we're defending over here is peace with freedom. And as long as we can ensure that there's peace with freedom here in Western Europe, then we can ensure that the United States is not going to have to get involved the third time this century in order to reestablish peace and freedom here in Western Europe, as we've had to do twice before. And we found after each time that we were here before that we immediately discharged almost all of our forces, held a relatively small force, except after World War II. And after World War II, even though there was an immediate flush from the system of all those citizen soldiers, after World War II, beginning in the 1950s, we realized that our national interests were involved here in Western Europe, so we decided that we would put the troops over here rather than having to send them over later and make amphibious landings in order to get ashore. And so we got the forces here. The purpose is to add our weight to that of all the other allies so that when the Soviets look west, they can see that there are going to be more pains than gains for the Soviets should she aggress against us. And that's what we're trying to prevent, you see, because West European peace with freedom is the United States peace with freedom. And I would also just add something which is sometimes not often understood. When one looks at where it is that the United States is the most vulnerable, and therefore where should you put your priorities insofar as security is concerned, you have to look at the homeland as being the number one priority, defending the homeland. But the number two priority has to be Western Europe. the defense of Western Europe and its security, because should there be a confrontation between Allied Command Europe and the Warsaw Pact here in Western Europe, it might well, and probably would, escalate all the way to the strategic nuclear exchange. And it's that strategic exchange that could cause such massive destruction, you see, on the homeland of the United States. And therefore, that's why I think the United States has rightly so kept Western Europe as the defense of Western Europe, its security, as the number 2 priority, second only to the defense of the homeland. So what would you say, short answer, what would you say? We're over there securing the peace and freedom of the United States in Western Europe. It's the defense of the Western Europe is what we're involved in, not just the defense of Western Europe.
It's interesting you always say this, too, is peace with freedom. A lot of people say peace, but a lot of people forget to add the other part of the equation.
Well, take the pacifists and the neutralists and the unilateral disarmers. Now, they can have their peace. You know, the ultimate fate of a pacifist is peace at any price. And the neutralists, they can have their peace. And the unilateral disarmers, they can have their peace, but they lose their freedom. And history will support that. And one way you can continue to have your peace with freedom is to, as I mentioned, have a posture, military posture, which will deter any potential aggressor from aggressing against you. And deterrence is in the mind of the beholder, and that's why we must have to continue to convince the Soviets that, should they aggress against us, the disadvantages that will befall her will be much greater than any advantages she would gain.
Let's talk about that other element. You said the manpower fill. Now, there's constant talk in Congress now about reducing the level of U.S. forces in Europe, both for financial reasons and, they say, to send a signal to our allies to do more on the behalf of defense of their own countries. Do you believe the troop strength levels will remain constant in the future years? Can you sort of look ahead right now?
Well, it's very difficult to predict. I do know that within the Congress there is a school of thought which says that believes that the West European nations are not bearing their fair share of the burden, as you suggested, and therefore, if they're not prepared to defend themselves, as the way the line goes, then why should we spend all of this money with our forward deployed troops? So let's bring them home. There's another school of thought also existing in Washington, not necessarily within the Congress, and that is we ought to bring a portion of those forces home, a sizable portion of those forces home, where they can be centrally located and thereby used wherever the United States must use them. So that feeling exists in Washington. I would not say that, I could not say that down the road we will have the same 325,000 end strength here in Western Europe that we have now, or in the European Command. I think that the attitude, the environment in Washington is such that we may find ourselves withdrawing some of these forces within the next 3 to 5 years. I think it'd be a mistake. I think it'd be a mistake, because I'm convinced that the vital interests of the United States are linked inextricably with those of Western Europe. I think that the U.S. Borderline is not along the east coast of the United States, not along the Atlantic shoreline, but rather it's along the German border and the border with Czechoslovakia. And so that if we withdraw those troops, I think that, well, first, it will be disastrous as far as NATO is concerned. It will be counter to the vital interests of the United States to withdraw our forces. It will unravel this alliance. And third, it will move the Soviets more quickly towards the objective they've set for themselves in Western Europe, which is to put themselves in a military posture where they can coerce and blackmail and intimidate West European nations without having to fire a shot. And our withdrawing our troops would move the Soviets much more quickly down that road. In fact, if our troops came out, the Europeans would interpret it was in one or two ways. First, they would say, well, the U.S. must know something we don't know about the threat, so the threat must be lessened, or they wouldn't withdraw their troops. Or the U.S. is giving up on its commitment to defend Western Europe and the U.S.'s own vital interests in Western Europe. And under those conditions, I think the West Europeans would seek an accommodation with the East. which is the last thing we want them to do, I would think.
Sir, you seem awfully pro-family, as opposed to a lot of people would say, let's go ahead and just send the soldier over to Europe for a year. We forget about the DOD schools. We forget about the PX. We forget about the MWR stuff. Send the soldier over. That way we cut our overhead. We bring him back in a year. We don't have to worry about shipping so many things, so much freight back and forth. What would you say to something like that?
Sure, that would solve a hell of a lot of problems, but I can tell you our standard of readiness would be much lower than it is now, because if you've got a one-year turnover, first place, we have sufficient sustaining base in the United States to sustain the opportunity for a man who's over here for 1 year to at least spend 2 years at home before he has to come back, you see. So that makes a large sustaining base you got to have back in the United States, in the first place. And secondly, the turnover impacts upon your readiness. It impacts upon your training, It even impacts on the ability of a man to get along with his with the troops in his squad or in his crew or what have you. So it has all kinds of impacts, and we've weighed that. But basically, why should those of us who wear the uniform not be allowed to have our families with us unless the conditions are such, as they are in Korea, the conditions are such that we have to have those kinds of tours, you see, unaccompanied tours. We have the right to be married. We have the right to have families. We have the right to have our families with us. We have the right to have our children taught in schools that are of high caliber. We have the right to have a high standard of living no matter where we are, even though it's difficult to achieve it. And it's up to us commanders to ensure that at least our voice is heard in a manner that makes sense when we appear before Congress or before the Defense Resources Board or wherever it may be, to try to get sufficient funding, you see, for our troops. And we never do. We never get adequate funding. And so what we have to say to ourselves is, well, you know, when you face yourself in the mirror and you face your conscience, have we done the best we could for the people whom we serve? And that's the job of a leader. It's to serve and take care of your people, and not the other way around. And you know, there are times when you think back, could I have made my presentation in a different way? Could I have beat the table harder, you see? What could I have done? And maybe, maybe there had been a different way to have convinced the Congress. But we have a lot of support in the Congress for our troops. But on the other hand, you have Graham-Rudman, and you have a certain parameters within which the budget must fit, you see, when you look at the budget of the whole country and for all the other activities. And I'm not so sure I would say we're doing the best we can for the services. The Congress is doing the best it can, because it could do better. And they did do better at one time. You know, I used to point with pride as a SACEUR the first 2 years of the first Reagan administration, because here was a government, a country that had economic constraints on it, just like all the other countries. And yet it found a way to increase the funding for security purposes and reduce it in other programs, social and public programs. That lasted for 2 years. Then the pendulum swung, and those who cry for social and public programs, you see, their voice became louder than those who were supporting security. And you find that true in almost every nation within Allied Command Europe. In fact, it's true in every nation. Public and social programs get higher priority than do the programs that support security and defense. And so it's just up to those of us who have the opportunity to raise our voice to ensure that, one, it's pitched fairly high, and secondly, that we got our ducks lined up, we know what we're talking about, and we can lay it out in a cogent, reasonable manner to the Congress to convince them that they need to provide more for security. But defense and security doesn't get votes, you see. Public and social programs get votes. And so, you know, we're dealing with the art of the possible in this business, Charlie. You see, the greatest social program that a government can do for its people is to keep them alive and free. There's an Englishman who said that once, and forgotten who it was, Churchill. But in any event, that's right. That's the greatest social program that any government can provide for its people, is to keep them alive and free. That means you got to be strong. That means you got to spend the money that's necessary as viewed against the threat, as reasonable people view that threat, in order to ensure that you keep your people alive and keep them free. And but it's not unique with the United States. I leave this theater at the end of this month with one of the greatest disappointments as a sanctuary in not having been able to see the people of Western Europe and the United States and Canada convinced that there is a threat to their freedom down the road. Not to their peace, but to the freedom that I described to you, which is the Soviets will achieve over time its objective here in Western Europe. That is to be able to coerce, intimidate, and blackmail without having to call the troops out of the barracks. And things that are occurring, the gap between our force capabilities and those of the Warsaw Pact, that gap continues to widen every year in the conventional side. Now we're starting to take away those vital tools we need by disarming on the nuclear side, so that there are two vital tools that the SACEUR needs in order to contribute to the deterrence in both his SINCUR and his SACEUR role, and they're starting to take those tools away from me by giving up the Pershing IIs, which can reach and very quickly, you see, and with certainty targets on the Soviet soil. Now, when the Soviet Union knows that we have that capability and can bring that pain to her, she knows that pain is going to be greater than the gains, and so we deter her. And we keep our peace and keep our freedom, you see. Well, we've lost that tool now. We'll lose it in the zero-level LRINF. And then as we reduce the range of our nuclear capability to keep Soviet targets, not Czech targets or East German targets or Polish targets, but Soviet targets at risk, even in those other nations, why, it reduces the pain that she's going to feel, you see, so it reduces the credibility of her deterrent. Now, I think that, coupled with this rising gap in our force capabilities, this nuclear disarmament, and that rising gap, it's pointing us in this direction that down the road, the Soviets are going to achieve their objective. And we'll be dancing, those of us who live in Western Europe, will be dancing to the tune of the Soviet piper. And as that day approaches, the United States won't have its forces here, and that'll just hasten the end product all the more.
If we can, I'd like to kind of, on a personal note, go back in history a little bit. Back a few years ago, when you were wearing gold bars instead of stars.
Long time ago.
Somebody came up to you and said, one day you're going to be the Supreme Allied Commander of Europe. You will be the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. forces in Europe. What do you think you would have said?
Well, I come from Kansas. And I'd have said to him, we've got an 8-letter word for that in Kansas. I'm thinking of nonsense. I don't know what you're thinking of. And I probably would have used that other 8-letter word in response to him.
As you look back on your 8 years, while we're still in the history mode here, let's look back at your last 8 years as the SINCUR. What are some of the highlights, some of the things that stick out in your mind?
Well, the ability to pull together a joint operation against Libya, which took much detailed planning and great effort, and to do that successfully. One of the bad things that's occurred since I've been here was the the loss of the lives of so many, 240 Marines in Lebanon to terrorists, which, none of us who bore responsibility for that will ever recover from, because there must have been a way for us to have done it so that wouldn't happen, you see. But it did happen. And that will weigh heavily on the minds of all of us who've been involved in that, as well as the good things that have happened. But the best things happened is just to have the opportunity to serve here 8 years with actually 326,400 troops and an equal number of family members.
General General Rogers will turn over his commands to General John Galvin in ceremonies at the end of next week. I'm Sergeant Pam Portland, bidding you a pleasant weekend and a good night.